My name is George Thomas Holloway, but most folks around Beaumont have called me Pop for the better part of 3 decades now. At 82 years old, I've seen my share of Texas sunrises from this old oak rocking chair on the front porch I built with my own hands back in '74. The chair creaks something fierce these days. But then again, so do my knees, so I figure we're a match set. I was sitting there this past Tuesday morning, nursing my second cup of Folgers, and watching the mockingbirds raise hell in the magnolia tree, when my grandson Logan came tiptoeing around the corner of the house like he was carrying state secrets. That boy's 8 years old, smart as a whip, and has his great-grandmother's eyes, the kind that see straight through to a man's soul. He climbed up on the porch rail and whispered those words that damn near stopped my heart cold. Now, I've worked 43 years in the oil fields around East Texas, from roughneck to field engineer, and I've heard plenty of bad news delivered in plenty of ways. I've been in blowouts, seen good men get crushed by equipment, watched oil prices tank and take whole families down with them. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for hearing those words from Logan's trembling little voice. "What do you mean, son?" I asked him, setting down my coffee cup, real careful like on the little table I'd made from scrap pine. My hands weren't quite as steady as I wanted them to be. The boy's mama is my daughter Cynthia, my only child, the little girl I used to carry on my shoulders to the Spindletop Museum when she was no bigger than Logan is now. His daddy is Craig, a man who married into this family 15 years ago and has been measuring the worth of everything in it ever since, including me. I sat there in that creaking chair feeling like I'd just taken a sucker punch to the gut. See, 3 years back, Cynthia had come to me with all sorts of talk about making things easier in estate planning. The house sits on 2 acres just off Highway 105 between Beaumont and Vador. It's nothing fancy, just a solid 3-bedroom ranch with a good foundation and a workshop out back where I still tinker with small engines for the neighbors. But every board, every nail, every coat of paint represents months of my life, weekends spent building something permanent for my family instead of fishing or hunting with the boys from the rig. After my Helen passed 5 years ago, 47 years of marriage, and still not enough, Cynthia and Craig moved in with me. Said it made sense, what with Craig being between construction jobs again and little Logan needing stability for school. I welcomed them with open arms, grateful for the company, and the sound of a child's laughter filling up rooms that had grown too quiet. But somewhere along the way, I'd stopped being the head of my own household and become the old man taking up space in theirs. I started noticing how Craig would talk about our plans for the property and when we renovate. I heard Cynthia on the phone with her nursing school friends calling it the family home like I was already 6 feet under. I realized, sitting there with Logan's worried eyes on my face, that I'd been seeing the signs for months. The way Craig would grunt when I asked for help with something. How Cynthia would sigh when I couldn't remember if I'd taken my heart medication. The hushed conversations that stopped when I walked into the kitchen. The way they both looked at me sometimes, like I was a problem they needed to solve. "Pop," Logan said, bringing me back to the moment. "Are you okay?" I reached over and ruffled his hair. That cowlick of his sticking up no matter what his mama does to it. "I'm fine, boy. Just thinking." But I wasn't fine. I was heartbroken in a way I hadn't been since Helen's funeral. This was my own flesh and blood, ready to ship me off to some sterile facility where I'd sit in a wheelchair and wait to die, surrounded by strangers who'd call me by my first name and talk to me like I was simple. The thing is, Logan didn't know, nobody knew, about the Oil Royalty Trust that's been sitting in a Beaumont National Bank safety deposit box for the past 22 years. Back in '02, I helped my old supervisor at Texaco navigate a mineral rights deal on some property outside Kilgore. As a thank you, he cut me in on a small percentage of a producing well. It started as a few $1,000s a year, barely worth mentioning. But with oil prices what they've been, that trust has grown to just over $320,000. I never told Helen about it, because I wanted it to be a surprise for our retirement. Maybe a trip to see the Grand Canyon or visit her sister in Colorado. After she passed, I just let it sit there, drawing interest, figuring I'd leave it to Cynthia someday. Now, sitting on my own front porch, being told I'm about to be evicted from my own life, I was starting to think differently about a lot of things. "Logan," I said, "you go on inside now. Don't you worry about grown-up business. Sometimes adults have to make hard decisions, and it's not your job to fix them." He nodded, but didn't move toward the door. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of paper, folded small and worn soft from handling. "I wrote you something," he said, pressing it into my palm. After he went inside, I unfolded that paper with hands that were shaking for real now. In his careful second-grade printing, using what looked like a red crayon, he'd written, "Dear Pop, if they make you go away, you can come live with me. I'll build you a bed in my room, and we can be roommates. I have enough toys to share. Love, Logan. P.S. Don't forget your coffee cup." That little note, written in crayon by the only person in this house who still saw me as family instead of a burden, was about to change everything. Sitting there with Logan's note in my weathered hands, my mind drifted back to 1974, when this patch of East Texas earth was nothing but scrub oak and fire ant hills. I was 39 years old then. Helen was pregnant with Cynthia, and we were living in a cramped apartment near the Magnolia refinery, where the smell of crude oil was so thick you could taste it in your morning coffee. I'd been working derrick floors and pump stations for 15 years by then, saving every overtime dollar I could scrape together. When old man Bergeron offered to sell me these 2 acres for $3,000 cash, Helen and I counted our money twice, said a prayer, and bought ourselves a piece of the American dream. What we got was raw land, but what I saw was possibility. Every weekend for 8 months, I was out here with my tools and a borrowed Catskill bulldozer, clearing land and digging the foundation by hand. The boys from my crew at Texaco would come by on Saturdays, and we'd work until dark, then sit on what would eventually become this front porch, drinking Lone Star and planning the next phase. Buck Morrison helped me frame the walls. Cal Monroe, still my hunting buddy to this day, ran electrical wire for beer money. Even Father Thibodeau's from St. Anthony's came out a few Sundays to help shingle the roof. This house rose from nothing. Board by board, nail by nail, every room has my sweat in the walls, my blood on the subflooring where I cut my hand hanging the kitchen cabinets. When Cynthia was born that October, I carried her out of the hospital and straight to this front porch, showing her the home I'd built with my own hands to keep her safe and warm. When Cynthia graduated from Vidor High in 1993, she said she wanted to be a nurse like her mama's sister in Dallas. The tuition at Lamar University's nursing program was steep for a roughneck salary, but I picked up extra shifts, worked double time during turnarounds, and somehow scraped together every penny. She met Craig at a hospital Christmas party in 1999. He was working construction then. Seemed like a decent enough young man who called me sir and held doors for Helen. When they got married in 2005, I gave them the wedding Helen had always dreamed of for her daughter. Ceremony at St. Anthony's, reception at the VFW Hall, and a honeymoon in San Antonio that cost me 3 months' wages. Craig's construction business never quite got off the ground. There was always something: permits taking too long, subcontractors skipping out, customers who wouldn't pay. When Logan was born in 2015, Craig was between jobs again, and I found myself covering their rent, their groceries, doctor bills for the baby. I didn't mind. That's what family does. But each time I bailed them out, Craig seemed a little less grateful and a little more entitled to my help. The real trouble started about 2 years ago. Craig began making comments about how old-fashioned the house was, how much potential the property had if someone would just update things properly. He'd walk through my living room pointing out carpet that needed replacing, walls that should be knocked out, fixtures that were totally outdated. He started measuring rooms without asking, sketching renovation ideas on napkins at dinner, talking about opening up the floor plan like this was some HGTV project instead of my home. Then the contractors started showing up. First, it was just Craig's buddy Danny from his construction days, giving estimates on minor improvements. Then it was actual licensed professionals, walking through my house with tape measures and clipboards while Craig followed behind them, describing his vision for maximizing the space. I noticed they never asked my opinion about anything. Last month, I came home from my Thursday afternoon coffee with Cal Monroe at the Brookshire Brothers Deli, to find Craig in my workshop, sorting through my tools like he was taking inventory. When I asked him what he was doing, he got that defensive tone he uses when he's been caught at something he shouldn't be doing. "Just organizing things, Pop," he said, not looking me in the eye. "Some of these old tools are worth good money. Might be time to think about selling off what you don't use anymore." Those tools represented 43 years of my working life. The socket set I'd bought with my first paycheck from Texaco. The level that had helped me build every straight wall in this house. The hand planer that belonged to my daddy, passed down from his carpentry days during the Depression. But Craig saw them as inventory, assets to be liquidated when convenient. About the same time, Cynthia started bringing up paperwork that needed my signature. "Power of attorney documents," she said, just in case something happened and she needed to handle my affairs. Medical directives that would let her make healthcare decisions if I couldn't. Bank account changes that would give her access to my checking account for emergencies. Each time she'd have some reasonable explanation, some story about making things simpler, protecting me from complications down the road. Then the neck to fool, I started signing things. Not everything. My years dealing with oil company contracts had taught me to read the fine print, but enough to make me realize now that I'd been steadily signing away pieces of my independence. The medical power of attorney, joint ownership of my checking account. Even a document that made Cynthia my healthcare proxy, which I didn't fully understand at the time. Last week, I found something that made my blood run cold. I was looking for my old surveyor's map in the desk drawer, wanted to show Cal Monroe the property lines so he'd know where he could park his deer stand come hunting season, when I came across a file folder I'd never seen before. Inside were copies of legal documents, including the deed transfer from 3 years ago. I sat in that desk chair for a long time, holding that paper and trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Someone, maybe the lawyer who'd drawn up the documents, had included protection I didn't even know existed. Whether Cynthia knew about it or not, there was a legal mechanism in place that could undo everything she and Craig were planning. That was Tuesday morning, right before Logan came to me with his whispered warning. I'd spent 3 days thinking about that reversion clause, wondering if I was reading it correctly, trying to decide what it might mean for my situation. Now, with Logan's crayon note still clutched in my hand, I was beginning to think that maybe the good Lord looks after stubborn old men who build their own houses and trust their children too easily. "Morning, Pop," Craig called out, not quite meeting my eyes. "These boys are here to move some furniture. Just clearing out your bedroom to make room for the hospital bed that's coming this afternoon." The hospital bed arrived at 2:30 that afternoon, along with a woman named Mrs. Patterson from Willow Creek Assisted Living, who talked to me like I was a confused child who'd lost his mittens. She had a clipboard full of forms and a voice that stayed artificially sweet, even when I asked direct questions about what was happening to my life. "Now, Mr. Holloway," she said, settling herself in Helen's old armchair without being invited, "your family has arranged for our basic care package, which includes 3 meals a day, medication management, and weekly housekeeping." Basic care package. That phrase stuck in my craw like a fishbone. I'd worked 43 years, paid taxes, raised a family, built a home with my own hands, and now I was being reduced to a basic care package, like some kind of bargain basement merchandise. Craig and 2 orderlies moved me into that sterile room at Willow Creek the next morning. My new home was 12 feet by 14 feet, with institutional green walls, a narrow bed, and a tiny bathroom where I could hear the man next door coughing through the thin walls. They'd brought a few of my things, my rocking chair wedged into the corner, a framed photo of Helen on the nightstand, and my old shaving kit arranged on a small dresser like museum pieces from a life I used to live. The first week was pure misery. Breakfast was served at 7:30 sharp, whether you were hungry or not. Lunch was at noon, dinner at 5, and lights out was at 9 o'clock like we were children at summer camp. The staff was pleasant enough, but they had that professional caregiver voice that never quite sounded genuine, the kind of forced cheerfulness that made me feel like I was already dead and just hadn't gotten the memo yet. I tried calling Cynthia several times, but she was always busy at the hospital or dealing with Logan's school situation. Craig never answered his phone at all. The few times Cynthia did visit, she'd bring magazines and hard candy, and stay exactly 30 minutes, checking her watch like she had somewhere important to be. We'd sit there making awkward conversation about the weather and Logan's baseball team while carefully avoiding the elephant in the room, namely how I'd ended up warehoused in this place against my will. It was Logan who saved my sanity. That boy started showing up every Thursday after school, riding his bicycle the 4 miles from Vidor Elementary to Willow Creek, because he'd told his mama he was staying late for baseball practice. The first time he appeared in my doorway, grinning and windblown with his backpack full of homework, I nearly cried right there in front of him. He reached into his backpack and pulled out my old compass, the brass one I'd carried in the oil fields for 20 years. It had belonged to my daddy, a surveyor in the East Texas oil boom, and I'd given it to Logan the previous Christmas, telling him it would always point him toward home. "I thought you might need this," he said, pressing it into my hands, "so you can find your way back when you're ready." During Logan's visits, we'd work on his homework together, or I'd tell him stories about the old days in the oil patch, or we'd just sit quietly while he drew pictures of the treehouse he wanted to build in the big oak behind my house. He never asked why I was there or when I was coming home, but I could see the questions in his eyes, the same confusion I was feeling about how everything had gone so wrong so fast. It was during one of those Thursday visits, about 3 weeks into my stay at Willow Creek, that I overheard the conversation that changed everything. Logan was using the bathroom down the hall when I heard Cynthia's voice coming from the nurse's station. She was on her cell phone, talking to someone about listing the house. "The realtor says we should wait another month or two," she was saying, her voice carrying that business-like tone she used at the hospital. "Once Pop's medication routine gets established and he settles in here, we can move forward with putting it on the market. Craig's already got contractors lined up to do some updates before we list it." Medication routine. I wasn't on any medications except for a blood pressure pill I'd been taking for 5 years and baby aspirin for my heart. But apparently, they had plans to change that, to fog my thinking with pills that would make me compliant and confused, a harmless old man who wouldn't cause trouble when they sold his life's work out from under him. I sat in my chair that evening after Logan had gone home, holding that compass and thinking about the situation with the clarity that comes from having nothing left to lose. I was 82 years old, but I wasn't dead yet. I'd built a career solving problems that stumped men half my age, navigating oil company politics and engineering challenges that required careful planning and strategic thinking. Maybe it was time to approach this mess the same way I'd approach a blowout or a stuck drill bit, methodically, professionally, and with the patience to see it through to the end. That's when I met Nadine Broussard, the woman who would become my secret weapon. She lived 3 doors down from me at Willow Creek, a sharp-eyed lady from Lake Charles who'd moved to Beaumont after her husband died. "You're the oil field man," she said one morning, settling herself at my table in the dining room without invitation. "I've been watching you, George Holloway. You've got that look of a man who's been backed into a corner." I studied her face, trying to decide how much I could trust this woman I barely knew. She had intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the kind of direct manner that reminded me of Helen when she'd made up her mind about something. "Because I know the look of family betrayal when I see it," she said, cutting into her scrambled eggs with surgical precision. "I also know the look of a man who's planning to do something about it. Question is, are you planning smart, or are you just planning angry?" That afternoon, while the other residents were watching Jeopardy in the common room, Nadine and I sat in the courtyard and I told her everything. The house I'd built, the papers I'd signed, the oil royalty trust nobody knew about, and the overheard phone conversation about medication and real estate listings. She listened without interrupting, occasionally asking sharp questions that showed she understood exactly what was happening. "You've got options," she said when I finished, "but you need to move fast, and you need to move smart. These people are counting on you being a harmless old man who'll sit here quietly while they rob you blind. Time to show them they miscalculated." That evening, after dinner and evening medications that I palmed and flushed down the toilet, I made a phone call from the payphone in the lobby. The number was for Rigtex Legal Consulting, the firm that had handled mineral rights and contract disputes for oil field workers since the 1980s. I'd used them twice during my career, once for a workers' compensation claim and once to help my supervisor at Texaco navigate that mineral rights deal that had made my oil royalty trust possible. Right, Tex Legal, this is Ben Torres speaking, came the familiar voice on the other end of the line. How can I help you? Ben Juarez remembered me right away, which shouldn't have surprised me since oil field legal work in East Texas is a small world where reputations matter and word travels fast. When I'd worked with RigTex 12 years back, Ben had been a junior associate handling contract reviews and mineral rights research. Now he was a partner specializing in elder law, estate planning, and something he called family exploitation cases. George Holloway, he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. I heard you'd retired from the patch. What can I do for you? I kept my voice low, conscious of the Willow Creek staff members, who seemed to have excellent hearing when it came to residents' private business. I need some legal advice, Ben. Got myself in a situation that requires careful handling. You calling from home? No, I'm calling from Willow Creek Assisted Living. That's part of the problem. There was a pause, and when Ben spoke again, his voice had shifted into professional mode. Why don't you tell me everything from the beginning? Take your time. I spent 20 minutes walking Ben through the whole mess. The deed transfer, the power of attorney documents, the forced move to Willow Creek, and the overheard conversation about medications and house sales. I also told him about the reversion clause I'd found in the deed papers, though I wasn't sure if I was reading it correctly. George, Ben said when I finished, this is textbook elder financial exploitation. The good news is, if that reversion clause says what you think it says, you've got substantial legal grounds to challenge everything they've done. The bad news is, we need to move fast before they can establish a pattern of mental incompetence or medication dependence that would complicate your case. We arranged to meet the following Tuesday at his office on College Street in Beaumont. Ben said he'd review the deed paperwork and research the legal precedents for elder abuse cases involving family members. He also suggested I start documenting everything: conversations, medication schedules, visiting patterns, any evidence that showed I was being isolated or controlled against my will. Nadine helped me develop what she called the documentation protocol. Every morning I'd write down what happened the previous day, who visited, what was said, what medications were offered, any interactions with staff or family members. She'd proofread my entries, asking questions that helped me remember details I might have overlooked. In legal disputes, she explained, memory isn't evidence, but contemporary documentation can be powerful testimony. You need to show that you're mentally sharp, that you understand what's happening to you, and that you're capable of making your own decisions about your life and property. I also started making discreet inquiries about my financial situation. I called Beaumont National Bank and confirmed that my oil royalty trust was still intact, $327,450 as of the previous month, with quarterly payments continuing to be deposited automatically. The bank officer, a woman named Mrs. Chen, who'd handled my account for 15 years, seemed surprised to hear from me. That conversation confirmed what I'd suspected. Cynthia and Craig were fishing for information about assets they didn't know about. They'd found my checking account and savings account, both of which were modest since I'd always lived below my means, but they had no idea about the oil trust, and I intended to keep it that way until the right moment. My meeting with Ben Juarez was scheduled for 10 a.m. on a Tuesday. I told the Willow Creek staff I had a doctor's appointment and arranged for a taxi, paying cash so there wouldn't be a paper trail. Ben's office was in a restored Victorian house near downtown Beaumont, the kind of place where serious legal work gets done without a lot of flash or fancy furniture. George, Ben said, standing up from behind a desk covered with law books and case files, you look good for a man who's supposedly too incompetent to live independently. Ben had changed in the 12 years since I'd worked with him. His hair was silver now, and he'd put on some weight, but his eyes still had that sharp intensity that made him effective in legal negotiations. He poured coffee from a coffee machine that looked older than Logan, and settled back in his chair to review the deed documents I'd brought. This is interesting, he said after studying the papers for several minutes. Very interesting. The attorney who drew these up included some protections that I don't think your daughter fully understood. This reversion clause is ironclad if you can prove you were moved to assisted living against your will, or if the property is sold without your consent. Ownership automatically reverts to you. Can we prove that? I thought about Father Thibodeau's at St. Anthony, Assane, where I'd been attending Mass for 40 years. About Cal Monroe, my hunting partner, who'd known me since the 1970s. About Mrs. Martinez at Brookshire Brothers, where I'd bought groceries every Thursday for the past decade. About Tommy Guidry at the auto parts store, where I still bought oil and filters for my old Chevy truck. Ben also suggested I undergo an independent mental competency evaluation with a geriatric psychiatrist he knew, Dr. Sarah Fontenot at Baptist Hospital. If we're going to challenge their narrative that you need managed care, we need professional documentation that you're mentally sharp and capable of independent living. The more we talked, the more I realized this was going to be a campaign, not a single battle. Like the complex engineering projects I'd managed in the oil patch, success would depend on careful planning, attention to detail, and the patience to see it through to completion. There's something else, I said, pulling out the paperwork for my oil royalty trust. They don't know about this. Ben studied the trust documents, and I watched his eyebrows rise. George, this changes things significantly. You're not a broke old man dependent on his family's goodwill. You're a man of substantial means who's been tricked into signing away his home. That makes this criminal fraud, not just family betrayal. But the biggest surprise came when Ben started researching the deed transfer more thoroughly. After making several phone calls to the Jefferson County Clerk's office, he called me back with news that made my heart skip a beat. George, there's a problem with the deed filing. A big problem. The notarization on your signature is dated 3 days before the document was actually signed, according to the witness signatures. That's a procedural error that invalidates the entire transfer. Even without the reversion clause, we can challenge the deed on technical grounds. I sat in that assisted living facility that evening, thinking about how 43 years of solving complex problems in high-pressure situations had prepared me for this moment. In the oil patch, when you hit an obstacle, you don't get emotional or give up. You analyze the situation, develop a strategy, and execute it step by step until you reach your objective. My objective was simple: get my home back, protect Logan from the fallout, and teach my daughter and her husband that stealing from an old man comes with consequences they hadn't considered. The first person I called was Cal Monroe, my hunting partner for nearly 30 years, and the closest thing to a brother I'd ever known. Cal was 79, 3 years younger than me, and had worked pipeline construction until his retirement in 2010. He lived alone in a double-wide trailer on 20 acres outside Vador, where he raised blue-tick hounds and maintained a deer lease that had been in his family since the 1950s. "Cal," I said when he answered his phone that Thursday morning, "I need your help with something. And it's not the kind of help most people would want to get involved with." There was a pause, then Cal's gravelly laugh. "George, you pulled my ass out of that hole when the pipeline ruptured back in '89. You sat with me in the hospital when Sarah had her cancer surgery. You've been the best friend I've ever had. Whatever you need, you got it." I drove out to Cal's place the following Saturday. My first time leaving Willow Creek without an appointment excuse. Cal met me on his front porch with a pot of coffee and the kind of serious attention he usually reserved for planning hunting strategy. I walked him through everything that had happened and watched his face get darker with each detail. "The son of a bitch," he said when I finished. "I never did like that Craig. Always struck me as the kind of man who'd measure your coffin while you were still breathing." He paused, studying my face. "What do you need me to do?" Ben Schwartz had given me a list of people who could provide character witness statements, folks who'd known me for years and could testify that I was mentally sharp, financially responsible, and perfectly capable of living independently. Cal agreed to help me reach out to them and coordinate their written statements. Father Thibodeau's at St. Anthony's was the first to respond. I'd been attending 8 a.m. Mass every Sunday for 40 years, serving as an usher and helping with the annual church barbecue fundraiser. He wrote a detailed letter describing my involvement in parish activities, my role as a mentor to younger parishioners, and his personal observations of my mental acuity, during our regular conversations about scripture and community service. Mrs. Martinez from Brookshire Brothers wrote about my weekly grocery shopping routine, how I'd always paid with cash, never forgot items on my list, and regularly helped elderly customers reach items from high shelves. She mentioned that I'd been the one to suggest the store install better lighting in the parking lot for safety, and had personally donated the materials for the project. Tommy Guidry from the auto parts store provided documentation showing that I'd continued to maintain my 1995 Chevy pickup truck myself, ordering specific parts and performing repairs that required technical knowledge and manual dexterity. His statement included receipts showing regular maintenance schedules and my ability to diagnose mechanical problems accurately. Dr. Fontenot's mental competency evaluation was scheduled for the following Wednesday. She spent 3 hours putting me through cognitive tests, memory exercises, and problem-solving scenarios. The results confirmed what I already knew. At 82, my mind was as sharp as it had been at 52. "Mr. Holloway," she said, reviewing her notes, "your cognitive function is well within normal ranges for your age group. In fact, your problem-solving skills and memory retention are superior to many people 20 years younger. There's absolutely no medical justification for managed care or supervised living." While I was building my legal case, Nadine was conducting her own investigation into Willow Creek's operations. As a former paralegal, she knew how to research corporate records and regulatory filings. What she discovered made both of us angry. Willow Creek was owned by a company called Senior Care Solutions, which operated 12 facilities across East Texas. Their business model depended on what Nadine called basic package residents, elderly people whose families paid for minimal care while the company collected government subsidies and insurance payments. The longer residents stayed and the more medications they required, the more profitable they became. "Your family is paying them $3,200 a month for your basic package," Nadine explained, showing me documents she'd obtained through carefully worded information requests. But between Medicare, Medicaid supplements, and pharmaceutical kickbacks, Willow Creek is probably collecting close to $6,000 a month for your care. They have a financial incentive to keep you here and keep you medicated. The most powerful support came from an unexpected source. Logan had been writing me letters. Not the crayon notes from before, but careful, adult-like letters in his best handwriting. When Nadine suggested that his perspective might be valuable for our legal case, I asked him to write about what it had been like living with me before I was moved to Willow Creek. His letter, written on notebook paper and decorated with crayon drawings in the margins, was heartbreaking in its honesty. Pop always helped me with my homework, and never got mad when I didn't understand math. He made me pancakes on Saturday mornings, and taught me how to use tools safely in his workshop. He remembered all my baseball games, and never forgot to ask about my friends at school. Mom and Dad were always busy with grown-up stuff, but Pop always had time to listen to me. I don't understand why they said he couldn't take care of himself when he was taking care of me. There was more to Logan's letter. Details about arguments he'd overheard between his parents about money and property. About Craig's plans to sell the house and buy something more modern in a better neighborhood. But the most damaging revelation came in his postscript. Dad told Mom they needed to be patient because old people don't live very long in nursing homes, especially when they get put on the right medications. I read that line several times, feeling a cold rage settle in my chest. They weren't just stealing my home, they were planning to wait for me to die, preferably sooner rather than later, so they could get on with their lives without the inconvenience of an elderly parent. I'd lost track of Jim after he retired and moved to Florida, and I'd honestly forgotten about the land until Ben Schwartz suggested we research all of my assets. When he tracked down the current value of that Austin property, we both nearly fell out of our chairs. 40 acres, 20 miles from downtown Austin, in the path of suburban development, was now worth $480,000. Between the Oil Royalty Trust, the Austin land, and my pension fund that I'd never touched, I was worth considerably more than Cynthia and Craig had imagined. But more importantly, I was no longer just a victim of their scheme. I was a man with resources, legal representation, and a growing network of people who were willing to testify on my behalf. Everything was coming together nicely until Logan disappeared. It was a Tuesday evening when Cynthia called me at Willow Creek, her voice tight with panic. "Daddy, have you seen Logan? He didn't come home from school, and nobody knows where he is. The school said he got on the bus like normal, but he never made it home." I knew exactly where that boy was, and I knew why he'd run away, but I also knew that Child Protective Services was probably already involved, which meant my legal battle had just become a lot more complicated. Logan was hiding in my workshop behind the house, curled up in the old sleeping bag I'd kept there for camping trips. Cal Monroe found him Tuesday night around midnight, drawn by the faint glow of a flashlight through the workshop window. The boy had been there since after school, surviving on peanut butter crackers and water from the garden hose, too scared to go home and too young to have anywhere else to run. Logan fell asleep in my arms in that narrow bed, exhausted from fear and confusion. I stayed awake all night, listening to him breathe, and thinking about how my legal battle had suddenly become about more than just getting my house back. "The boy has been coming to see me regularly," I told Miss Rodriguez, keeping my voice calm and factual. "He's been worried about changes in his home situation, and apparently he overheard conversations that made him feel unsafe." Craig stepped forward, his face red with anger. "Pop's been filling the kid's head with nonsense about us trying to get rid of him. Logan's just confused because of all the changes, and having his grandfather interfere isn't helping." Miss Rodriguez was a professional, probably in her 40s, with the kind of sharp eyes that had seen every variety of family dysfunction. She looked at Logan, who was pressed against my side like he was trying to disappear, then at Craig and Cynthia, then back at me. "Mr. Holloway," she said, "I need to ask you some questions about Logan's visits and what he might have told you about his home environment." What followed was a careful conversation, where I walked the line between protecting Logan and not making accusations I couldn't prove. I mentioned his concerns about being sent away, his confusion about why I'd been moved to assisted living, and his general anxiety about changes in the family. I also mentioned that Logan was an excellent student, a polite boy, and had never shown signs of behavioral problems during his visits with me. Miss Rodriguez took notes and asked follow-up questions that showed she understood family dynamics better than most people. When she was finished interviewing me, she spoke with Logan privately, then with Cynthia and Craig together, then with each of them separately. The whole process took 3 hours, and by the end of it, Logan was going home with his parents, but Miss Rodriguez was opening a case file. "Mr. Holloway," she said before leaving, "I'll be scheduling a home visit to assess Logan's living situation. I'll also want to speak with you again about your observations of the family dynamics. Would you be available for that?" After they left, I called Ben Juarez and told him what had happened. We both knew that Logan's situation had added urgency to everything we were doing. If Craig and Cynthia were willing to ship their son off to Dallas to simplify their lives, there was no telling what other decisions they might make in the coming weeks. "George, it's time to file," Ben said. "We've got enough evidence to seek an injunction against any sale of your property, and the CPS investigation actually strengthens our case by showing a pattern of family dysfunction and poor decision-making." That Thursday morning, Ben filed a temporary restraining order in Jefferson County District Court, seeking to freeze any sale or transfer of my property. He also filed a formal complaint with Texas Adult Protective Services alleging elder financial exploitation, and he submitted a motion to have the original deed transferred declared invalid due to the improper notarization. The legal papers were served on Cynthia and Craig that Friday afternoon. According to Ben, Craig answered the door, read the first page of the court documents, and immediately called a lawyer. Within 2 hours, their attorney, a man named Davidson from a firm in Houston, had contacted Ben's office, demanding an immediate conference call. "They're panicking," Ben told me after the call. "Their lawyer is talking about settlement negotiations, which means they know they're in serious legal trouble. But Craig is insisting this is all a misunderstanding, that they were only trying to protect your interests." The court hearing for the temporary injunction was scheduled for the following Wednesday. Ben explained that we'd have to prove I was mentally competent, that the deed transfer was invalid, and that there was immediate danger of irreversible harm if the court didn't intervene. Meanwhile, Cynthia and Craig would argue that they were acting in my best interests, and that my legal challenge was evidence of mental decline. What they didn't know was that I had one more asset they hadn't discovered. Back in 1987, when Helen was worried about our financial security, I'd opened a certificate of deposit at First National Bank in Orange under her maiden name, Broussard. That CD was now worth $75,000, and it was going to pay for the best legal representation I could afford. When I told Ben about the additional funds, he smiled for the first time since I'd hired him. George, with this kind of financial backing, we can take this case as far as we need to go. And if they want to fight dirty, we've got the resources to fight back. The first sign that Craig was truly panicking came Saturday morning when Cal Monroe called me at Willow Creek. Someone had been snooping around my property during the night, shining flashlights in the workshop windows and trying to jimmy the lock on the back door of the house. I was checking my trail cameras when I saw fresh footprints in your driveway. Cal said, whoever it was spent time looking through your workshop, probably searching for documents or anything else that might help their case. Ben advised me to file a police report for trespassing, which created another paper trail showing Craig's increasingly desperate behavior. But the real breakthrough came Tuesday, the day before our court hearing, when Ben called me with news that changed everything. George, I just got off the phone with Miss Rodriguez from CPS. Craig has been subpoenaed to provide financial records showing how he's been supporting his family for the past 3 years. Apparently, there are some discrepancies between his reported income and his spending patterns that have raised red flags. It seemed that Craig's construction business hadn't been as unsuccessful as he'd claimed. According to tax records and bank statements, he'd been earning decent money but had been hiding it from Cynthia, probably to avoid paying child support from a previous relationship that nobody in the family knew about. More importantly, the financial investigation had uncovered evidence that Craig had been forging my signature on checks from my regular banking account, stealing small amounts over time in a pattern that looked like systematic elder abuse. The Jefferson County District Court was packed that Wednesday morning like Sunday service at a popular church. Word had gotten around Beaumont's tight-knit community that an 82-year-old oil field veteran was taking his own family to court over elder abuse. And apparently that was the kind of story that drew spectators. I saw faces I recognized from St. Anthony's, from the VFW, from Brookshire Brothers, and from 3 decades of working in the oil patch. Judge Patricia Landry was a woman in her 50s who'd built a reputation for no-nonsense courtroom management and careful attention to elder law cases. She'd been on the bench for 12 years, and Ben Juarez had told me she was fair, but demanded that attorneys come prepared with facts instead of emotional arguments. I wore my best suit, the navy blue one I'd bought for Helen's funeral, and sat at the plaintiff's table next to Ben, feeling more nervous than I'd been since my first day working on a drilling rig in 1962. Behind me sat my witnesses, Cal Monroe, Father Thibodeaux, Dr. Fontenot, and Nadine Broussard, who'd been granted permission to attend despite still being a Willow Creek resident. On the other side of the courtroom sat Cynthia and Craig with their attorney, a smooth-talking Houston lawyer named Davidson, who wore an expensive suit and carried himself like he was used to winning. Cynthia looked nervous and kept glancing at me like she was hoping I'd change my mind and call off the whole proceeding. Craig sat stone-faced, his jaw clenched, staring straight ahead like he was enduring an unpleasant medical procedure. Ben opened our case by reading the basic facts. I was an 82-year-old retired petroleum engineer who'd built his own home, lived independently until 3 months ago, and had been moved to assisted living under circumstances that suggested elder exploitation. He submitted Dr. Fontenot's mental competency evaluation, the character witness statements, and the deed documents showing both the reversion clause and the improper notarization. When Judge Landry asked me to take the witness stand, I walked up there on steady legs and placed my hand on the Bible like I was swearing to tell the truth in God's house. The questions Ben asked me were ones we'd practiced, but my answers came from 43 years of explaining complex technical problems to people who needed to understand them clearly. I described my daily routine, cooking my own meals, maintaining my truck, managing my finances, helping Logan with homework, participating in church activities, and handling all the normal responsibilities of independent living. I explained that I'd signed the deed transfer papers, trusting my daughter's explanation about estate planning, but that I'd never agreed to be moved to assisted living or to have my home sold. No, sir. I was handling my own affairs just fine. Still am, despite what some people might want to believe. The cross-examination from Davidson was more aggressive. He suggested that I was a confused old man who didn't understand modern estate planning, that my family had made difficult decisions to protect me from myself, and that my legal challenge was evidence of paranoia and mental decline. Mr. Holloway, Davidson said, isn't it true that you've been hiding assets from your family, including substantial bank accounts that you never disclosed to your daughter? I haven't been hiding anything, I replied calmly. I've been managing my own finances, which is what mentally competent adults do. The fact that I didn't discuss every detail of my financial affairs with my daughter doesn't make me incompetent. It makes me independent. Sir, I take 1 blood pressure pill and baby aspirin, same as I've taken for 5 years. My memory is fine. My driving record is clean, and I've never missed paying a bill in my adult life. If you want to challenge my mental competence, you're welcome to test me on petroleum engineering, Texas history, or scripture verses. I'm confident in my abilities in all 3 areas. When Logan's letter was read aloud by Ben Juarez, the courtroom went completely silent. His 8-year-old perspective on the situation was more powerful than any expert testimony could have been. Pop always had time to listen to me. He's the only one who listens to me. I don't understand why they said he couldn't take care of himself when he was taking care of me. I watched Cynthia during the reading of Logan's letter, saw her tears, and the way she looked at me with something that might have been shame. For a moment, I thought I saw my little girl again. The one I'd carried on my shoulders and taught to ride a bicycle in the driveway I'd poured with my own hands. But the most dramatic moment came when Cynthia took the witness stand, and Davidson asked her to explain the family's decision to move me to assisted living. She started with the prepared answers about my safety and their concerns about my ability to live alone. But under Ben's cross-examination, the real story came out. Mrs. Patterson, Ben said, using her married name with formal courtesy, who first suggested that your father should be moved to assisted living? But who brought it up first? Was it your idea or your husband's idea? Cynthia looked at Craig, then at Davidson, then back at Ben. Craig said that Dad was getting to be too much responsibility and that we needed to think about our own family's future. He mentioned that the house was too big for Dad to maintain, and that if something happened to him, we'd need to deal with the property anyway. Then Ben asked the question that broke her down completely. Mrs. Patterson, did your husband ever threaten to leave you if you didn't cooperate with his plans regarding your father? Cynthia started crying then, real tears that couldn't be faked or hidden. He said he wasn't going to spend the rest of his life taking care of an old man who didn't appreciate anything we did for him. He said, if I chose Dad over our marriage, I could take care of both of us by myself. The courtroom was silent, except for Cynthia's quiet sobbing. I felt my own heart breaking, not just for what she'd done to me, but for what Craig had put her through to make her do it. My daughter had betrayed me, but she'd been coerced into it by a man who'd used their marriage and her fear of abandonment as weapons. Judge Landry called a brief recess, and when court resumed, she delivered her ruling with the kind of measured authority that comes from years of dealing with family disputes that had gone too far. Based on the evidence presented, she said, I find that the deed transfer was improperly executed and is therefore invalid. The reversion clause clearly states that ownership returns to Mr. Holloway in cases of involuntary placement in managed care, and the evidence shows that his placement at Willow Creek was against his expressed wishes and best interests. But then she looked directly at me and asked the question I'd been dreading, Mr. Holloway, do you wish to press criminal charges against your family members for elder abuse? I stood up slowly, looking across the courtroom at Cynthia, who was still crying, and at Craig, who was staring at me with undisguised hatred. I thought about Logan, and about what would happen to him if his parents went to jail. I thought about the family I'd built and lost, and might possibly still save. Your Honor, I said, I don't want criminal charges. I just want my home back and my grandson protected. But I want full custody of my property, and I want them out of my house within 30 days. The eviction notice was served on Cynthia and Craig the following Monday morning by Jefferson County Sheriff's Deputy Marcus Tran, a young man who'd grown up in Vidor and remembered when I'd helped his father find work at the Texaco refinery back in the 1990s. Deputy Tran was professional and polite, but I could see in his eyes that he understood the situation and had no sympathy for people who'd steal from their own family. 30 days to vacate the premises, he told Craig, who answered the door in his underwear and a t-shirt like he'd been expecting Publishers Clearinghouse instead of a court order. Any personal property left after that becomes the legal responsibility of the property owner. I wasn't there to see Craig's reaction, but Cal Monroe was parked across the street in his pickup truck, keeping an eye on things for me. According to Cal, Craig read the eviction notice twice, crumpled it up, threw it on the ground, then picked it up and smoothed it out again like that might change what it said. My first day back home was strange and wonderful and heartbreaking, all at the same time. The house felt different, smaller somehow, and marked by the presence of people who'd never truly belonged there. Craig and Cynthia had rearranged furniture, painted walls without asking, and installed a flat-screen television in the living room that dominated the space like some kind of electronic altar. The Oil Royalty Trust and the Austin land deal had given me financial options I'd never had before. Instead of living like a broke old man dependent on Social Security, I could afford quality in-home care if I needed it, or I could continue living independently with support services. More importantly, I could make decisions about my own life instead of having decisions made for me. Nadine Broussard was my first house guest in the new arrangement. I'd offered her the upstairs bedroom rent-free in exchange for companionship and her legal expertise if any other problems arose. She accepted immediately, partly because she'd grown to hate Willow Creek as much as I had, and partly because she understood that two sharp-minded elderly people could take better care of each other than any institution could take care of either one of them. "George," she said, settling into Helen's old armchair with a cup of coffee and her knitting, "this is the first time in 3 years I felt like I was living in a home instead of just waiting to die in a facility." The hardest part of the whole situation was Logan. The CPS investigation was ongoing, and Miss Rodriguez had determined that while Craig and Cynthia weren't unfit parents, there were family stability issues that needed to be addressed. Logan started spending weekends with me, officially this time, with court-ordered permission that Craig couldn't interfere with. Those Saturday and Sunday visits became the highlight of my week. We'd work on his homework together, putter around in the workshop, and plan projects for the future. He helped me plant a vegetable garden behind the house, and we started building the tree house he'd drawn pictures of during his visits to Willow Creek. The treehouse project became something more than just carpentry. It was a symbol of permanence, of plans that stretched into the future, of an old man and a young boy who were building something together that nobody could take away from them. Every weekend we'd make a little more progress, and Logan would chatter about how it would have windows and a rope ladder and a secret compartment for storing important things. Cynthia and Craig's marriage didn't survive the legal battle. The financial investigation that CPS had ordered revealed not only Craig's forged checks from my account, but also a pattern of hidden debts, unpaid child support, and tax problems that painted a picture of a man who'd been living beyond his means for years. When Cynthia learned that he'd been stealing from me to cover his own financial irresponsibility, something snapped in their relationship that couldn't be repaired. She filed for divorce 6 weeks after the court ruling, and Craig moved out of the house 3 days before his 30-day eviction deadline. He took his tools, his truck, and his clothes, but he left behind a decade and a half of mess that Cynthia was going to have to clean up alone. The divorce proceedings revealed more unpleasant truths. Craig had been having an affair with a woman in Beaumont for over 2 years. He'd been using my home as collateral for loans I knew nothing about. He'd even contacted a developer about subdividing my 2 acres into house lots, figuring he could make more money that way than just selling the property intact. But the revelation that made me angriest was something Logan told me one Saturday while we were working on the treehouse. Apparently, Craig had been telling people around town that I was losing it mentally, and that it was just a matter of time before I had to be put in a memory care facility. He'd been laying the groundwork for his story months before they actually moved me to Willow Creek. The new will I drafted with Ben Dowers reflected the changes in my family situation and my financial circumstances. The house and property went to Logan, with a life estate provision that would let me live there for as long as I chose. The oil royalty trust was split between Logan and Nadine, recognizing her as the family member she'd become during the crisis. The Austin land would be sold when the time was right, with the proceeds funding Logan's education and whatever remained going into a trust for his future. Cynthia was provided for, but modestly. She'd get my old Chevy pickup truck, some family photographs and heirlooms, and $50,000 in cash, enough to help her get back on her feet after the divorce, but not enough to make her wealthy on my dime. More importantly, the will included language that specifically excluded Craig from any inheritance, even if he and Cynthia somehow reconciled. The most important provision in the new will named both Nadine and Logan as my co-beneficiaries and made them responsible for carrying out my final wishes. I'd learned that you can't depend on legal documents alone to protect your interests. You need people who genuinely care about you and will fight to honor your intentions. One evening in late November, as I was sitting on the porch watching Logan rake leaves in the front yard, he came running over with a roll of papers he'd been carrying around all day. "Pop," he said, breathless with excitement, "I finished the plans for our treehouse. Want to see? This is going to be the best treehouse in Jefferson County," he said, grinning up at me. "And when it's finished, we can have our own private place where nobody can bother us." By spring of the following year, my house had been transformed into something I'd never imagined when I built it with my own hands back in 1974. What started as a home for my family had become a gathering place for boys who needed what I'd learned about life, work, and surviving disappointment with dignity intact. Then came Ethan, whose grandfather had died, and whose father was deployed overseas with the National Guard. Ethan was fascinated by my stories about the oil patch, and spent hours listening to me explain how drilling worked, how petroleum products were refined, and what it meant to work with your hands in an industry that built the modern world. Before long, I had 5 boys showing up regularly, ranging in age from 8 to 13, all of them missing some piece of male guidance in their lives. Their mothers were grateful for the supervision and the positive influence. The boys were hungry for the kind of practical knowledge that used to get passed down from fathers and grandfathers, but was getting lost in a world where families scattered and men disappeared from their children's lives.